Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. Thanks for joining us on Close Up. The Senate wrapped up its work week by confirming the first woman to head the Central Intelligence Agency. But Director Gina Haspel did face some criticism, and New Hampshire's U.S. senators split over whether to support her confirmation. Senator Jeanne Shaheen was a yes vote to confirm, and she joins us here this morning. Senator, thanks for being here.
Nice to be here.
So explain for us. Obviously, Director Haspel came in for some criticism with her involvement in Bush-era programs of enhanced interrogation and her reported leadership of one of these so-called secret prisons over there in Thailand. What did she tell you about her involvement in those programs that brought you around to a yes vote on her confirmation?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, Adam. First of all, she said very clearly those techniques, the enhanced interrogation techniques, or torture, as many people call it, were wrong, and she would never allow the CIA to engage in that kind of technique in the future. So I was pleased to hear her say that. She has 33 years of experience. She will only be she'll be the first director in over 50 years who comes up through the agency. And, you know, I voted for John Brennan when he was nominated by President Obama. He had been at a higher level than Gina Haspel and made some decisions about that period that I think none of us are proud of. And so I thought that it was only fair to hold her to the same standard as John Brennan. And the thing that I like about her is she has a lot of support from the agency, people who work there, but she's also not political. So she's interested in providing the best information possible, and she's not going to color it by ideology or to address the politics of a situation, and I think that's really important.
Obviously, there's a different matrix for each one of these confirmation hearings, but you voted to confirm Gina Haspel. You voted against confirming Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, citing, quote, his past statements and policy views, particularly in regards to the LGBTQ community, American Muslims, and women's reproductive rights. On your scale, how are Secretary Pompeo's words rating worse than the alleged actions of Director Haspel?
Well, I voted for Secretary Pompeo when he was being nominated to be head of the CIA. So I voted for him. I think the head of the CIA and Secretary of State are very different jobs. The Secretary of State is a policy position, and they are the face of the United States with the rest of the world. I think it's for me, it's a concern that we have somebody who, as a member of Congress, when he was not following orders, when he was following his own what he thought was right, made a number of anti-Muslim statements, made a number of statements against the LGBTQ community. Those are issues that we face around the world with countries, a lot of Muslim countries that we're dealing with, some of our partners and some who are not. And I think it's hard to argue and to present the importance of America's freedoms and equality for all when he's had those kinds of statements in the past. The same is true with the LGBTQ community, because there are countries where they imprison and kill gay citizens, and I think it's important to have a Secretary of State who's going to be unequivocal about the human rights that America stands for around the world.
Let's stay with foreign policy. Very precarious situation in the Middle East, civil wars in Yemen, obviously Syria, chemical weapons in Syria. Now we have unrest surrounding this embassy move in Israel, and of course the Iran deal, the U.S. pulling out of that. There's a lot more conflict seemingly right now than diplomacy going on. What's your level of concern that we're going to see war erupt in the Middle East, particularly between Israel and Iran?
Well, I'm very concerned about that. We had a session yesterday in the Senate where we heard from an Iran expert who talked about the impact of pulling out of the Joint Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and what the potential that means for implosion in Iran, for the hardliners to take over, what it means for increased conflict between Iran and Syria, and I think between Iran and Israel in Syria, and I think there's a very real reason to be concerned about that. We do need more robust diplomacy. I was disappointed, and I said so at the time, about the president's decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, because I thought it would have ramifications that would increase conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that's what we've seen with a number of Palestinians killed at the border. And we did that without getting anything in return, without making it part of a peace agreement or part of something that would have had Netanyahu agree to stop settlements, for example, in exchange for moving the embassy, so that we could have advanced a peace deal in the Middle East. This was just an effort of the president to speak to his base, and I think it didn't advance diplomacy in the Middle East, and we need more diplomacy, not less.
And this doesn't get a lot of coverage in the United States, but now you see Assad going to Moscow to talk to Putin, or not Moscow, Sochi. You see Netanyahu going to Putin. What are the implications of the fact that the broker right now in the Middle East is increasingly Russia?
Well, that's not good for the United States. We've left a vacuum there. And if Russia were willing to step up and actually try and promote a Middle East peace deal that would have all of the players at the table, including the United States, that would be a positive move, but they are not doing that. What they're doing is supporting the Assad regime and supporting increased conflict in Syria rather than supporting a settlement.
Moving over to North Korea, we see some cracks in the friendlier facade that the North Koreans presented recently. Should we tolerate the gamesmanship, which of course is always there with them, but with the outside chance that we might get to some denuclearization? Should we tolerate what's going on and not, I guess, re-escalate conflict?
I think we should not re-escalate the rhetoric that's going on right now. I think, as you point out, this is the way North Korea has behaved in the past when we've been talking about negotiations, and I think the president's not responding to the recent comments is a positive sign. I think we want to get to negotiations. We want to do whatever we can to reduce the potential for conflict with North Korea, but we also need to be strong about how we go into those discussions. I think we need to be realistic about what the expectations are. I think it's very hard for me to believe that one session is going to produce a willingness on the part of Kim Jong-un to give up all of his nuclear weapons, and so we have to look at what we can accomplish. I think getting the Americans freed, that was very positive, and I applaud Secretary Pompeo for his work to do that. But this is still a dangerous situation. Whatever we can do to de-escalate it is important, but we don't want to give up our troops on the Korean Peninsula that have been so important. We don't want to make unilateral concessions to Kim Jong-un in a way that would weaken our position.
Does President Trump deserve credit here? It seems like some Democrats are kind of exasperated that this progress is being made.
Well, I think he does. I think we would rather see a de-escalation than conflict. And so I think it's important to recognize that, and I hope that he will continue to do that, and I hope there will be a robust understanding of what it's going to take long term to get these negotiations done. What I've heard from experts on North Korea, from those who have tried to negotiate with the country in the past, is that we need to recognize what's possible. Experts have said that Kim Jong-un is not going to give up his nuclear weapons unless we are willing to totally vacate the Korean Peninsula with all of our troops. I don't think that's something we can agree to. So we have to see what's possible here.
You talk about a realistic outcome. I mean, what is the best case scenario as you're hearing from these experts?
Well, to understand that this is probably going to be a long-term negotiation, that there are things that can be done in the short term that are really helpful to try and reduce tensions. Some of that has already begun with the summit between the North and South. That was a positive move. With the idea that we will negotiate with North Korea, that's also very positive. But to understand that he's not likely to give up his weapons in the short term, and so this needs to be a long-term negotiation. We need to continue to keep sanctions in place until we reach some agreement and accommodation that we can support. We probably want to make sure that he doesn't continue testing of his weapons. That would be a start. He said he's going to stop testing right now. He's going to destroy his missile site, one of them that he's used, but we need to look at inspections. We need to look at making sure that if there is an agreement, it's going to be one that long-term is going to require that he give up all of those weapons.
We'll wrap up this block with a look at a sort of foreign policy, domestic policy issue. Obviously, the Russia investigation continues. You hear a lot from the president's team right now. Let's just wrap this thing up, which is a familiar refrain from the 90s with the special counsel investigations into the Clinton administration. Setting aside the fact, I'm sure you believe that the investigation should continue. Long term, is it problematic that we continue to have, over the decades here, these investigations pop up and they're kind of open-ended and they end up boxing in the executive?
I think when there are allegations that suggest there is wrongdoing, that they need to be investigated, and the president and whoever that president is not above that. Now, let's look at what Robert Mueller has done in the year that this investigation has been underway, because I think that's the best way to determine whether this is warranted or not. The fact is, he's gotten 19 indictments. He's gotten 5 guilty pleas. One person has gone to jail. And among those who have pleaded guilty have been Trump's former campaign manager has been indicted. His former deputy campaign manager, Rich Gates, has pleaded guilty. Papadopoulos, the person he named as his foreign policy advisor, has pleaded guilty. So this is an investigation. Oh, and we've also seen 13 Russians and 3 Russian organizations that have been indicted. So this is producing real results. And what we have to remember is that this is not a partisan investigation, despite what we're hearing from President Trump and his administration. The fact is, this is a response to aggression against the United States by a foreign country. Russia tried to influence our elections, and we can't let that go unanswered. We've got to get to the bottom of that. We've got to find out who was involved. This is not a question of partisanship. This is a question of patriotism. Are we willing to allow a foreign aggressor to influence our elections here in the United States?